Välkomna till Bonniers Konsthall. Det är fint det här. Alltså jag har aldrig fått såna här regianvisningar förut. Stå där så att du syns i bild. Jag heter Jonas Ellerström och jag håller mig alltså normalt sett lite i marginalen. Och här ska jag leda, eller i alla fall delta i ett samtal som har samtida polsk poesi i fokus. Och framförallt Krystyna Dąbrowskas poesi som nyligen har presenterats på svenska i urvalet via en ordbok och andra dikter. Och det är Irena Grönberg som har stått för översättningarna. Och det är deras två röster ni ska få höra som en inledning på det här samtalet. Då ni får höra Krystynas dikter, alltså både i sitt polska original och med författarens eget tonfall. Och också översättningarna med översättarens eget tonfall. Varsågoda.
Okay. Hello, I'm very happy that you came here and so many people. I'm really surprised because the hour is a bit crazy. And we decided to start with poems. I will read one poem in Polish, so just for you to hear how it sounds. It's a very old poem from my first book, Biuro Podróży, which means travel agency.
When Krystyna says very old, it's 2016, so it's not 2006, sorry. It's a bit older, but not very old.
Okay. Biuro Podróży. Jestem biurem podróży dla umarłych. Organizuję im przeloty do snów żywych. Zgłaszają się do mnie sławne osobistości, jak Heraklit, żeby odwiedzić zakochanego w nim pisarza, ale i zmarli nieznani szerzej, jak pewien gospodarz ze wsi Wasiły, pragnący doradzić żonie w sprawie hodowli królików. Czasem wielopokoleniowa rodzina czarteruje samolot i ląduje na czole ostatniego potomka. Mam też do czynienia z zabitymi, którzy, kursując regularnie do snów ocalałych, zbierają punkty w programie Frequent Flyer. Nikomu nie odmawiam swoich usług, wynajduję jak najlepsze połączenia i wyrzucam sobie, kiedy młody chłopak, żeby dostać się do snu swojej dziewczyny, musi lecieć z przesiadką w śnie chrapiącej baby. Albo gdy warunki pogodowe powodują awaryjne lądowanie i umarły dzwoni: zrób coś, utkwiłem w śnie przerażonego dziecka. Takie wypadki to stres i wyzwanie dla mnie, małego biura o dużych ambicjach, bo chociaż nie mam wstępu ani do świata zmarłych, ani do cudzych snów, dzięki mnie się spotykają. Okay, so another poem in Polish, but then in Swedish. So another poem is the title poem of my second book, Białe krzesła, which means white chairs. Białe krzesła. Codzienność w poezji niech będzie jak białe plastikowe krzesła pod ścianą płaczu. To na nich, nie w ozdobnych fotelach, modlą się starzy rabini, czołami dotykając kamieni w murze. Zwyczajne plastikowe krzesła, wspinają się na nie kobiety i mężczyźni, żeby siebie widzieć ponad dzielącą ich przegrodą. I matka chłopca, który ma bar micwę, wchodzi na krzesło i obsypuje cukierkami syna żegnającego dzieciństwo. Codzienność w poezji niech będzie jak te krzesła, które znikają, żeby zrobić miejsce dla tanecznego kręgu w szabatowy wieczór.
Då kommer den svenska översättningen. Resebyrån. Jag är en resebyrå för de döda. Jag ordnar flyg åt dem till de levandes drömmar. Till mig kommer celebriteter som Herakleitos för att besöka en författare, så har de kära. Men även föga kända döda, som en viss bonde från byn Wasiły som ville ge sin hustru råd om kaninuppfödning. Ibland chartrar flera släkt ledet plan och landar på den sista ättlingens panna. Jag har även att göra med omkomna som pendlar till de överlevandes drömmar och samlar poäng i bonusprogrammet Frequent Flyer. Jag förvägrar ingen mina tjänster. Jag hittar de allra bästa rutterna och grämer mig då en ung man som vill in i sin flickväns dröm måste flyga via en snarkande kärring. Eller då vädret orsakar en nödlandning och den döde ringer. Gör något. Jag är fast i ett barns mardröm. Den sortens tillbud är en utmaning för mig. En liten resebyrå med stora ambitioner. För även om jag inte kommer åt de dödas värld eller andras drömmar möts de tack vare mig. Vita stolar. Det vardagliga i poesin. Låt det vara som de vita plaststolarna vid klagomuren. Det är på dem, inte i praktfulla fåtöljer. Gamla rabbiner sitter och ber och rör vid murstenarna med sina pannor. Vanliga vita plaststolar. Kvinnor och män klättrar upp på dem för att kunna se varandra över skiljeväggen. Och mamman till en pojke som firar bar mitzva klättrar upp på en stol och häller karameller över sonen som tar avsked av sin barndom. Det vardagliga i poesin. Låt det vara som stolarna som plockas bort för att ge plats åt en dansande skara på sabbatskvällen.
Our conversation will now turn to English for practical reasons. And Irena and Krystyna, I asked you specifically to read the title poem from your second collection, the one about the white chairs. It was the one that we heard last. Because I suspect that what you are talking about in this poem is something that is consistent it seems to be consistent in your poetry through 15 years of writing. And it's the key phrase of the poem, and very well rendered in Irena's translation, goes the everyday things in poetry, the everyday quality to poetry. This is something that you both evoke in this poem, but also gives a kind of direction. How is this quality to be treated in poetry? Is it true that the everyday, the quotidian even, is of importance to you?
It is very important, but also this poem was written quite a long time ago. So now, it's like a bit strange text to me. I think it's always like this, and I cannot say I identify totally with what I've thought at the time and what I've written. I really need to have, in my poems, I really think it's important that they are based in not even everyday experience, but just in experience. I know that many poets think that the most important thing in poetry is some kind of experimenting with the language, and sometimes it's even like an abstract game, word game. And for me, it's always important that the language corresponds to experience, and this experience doesn't need to be something very extraordinary or specially. It can be everyday things, but also what I think is important that these everyday things, they have to be transformed. You cannot just take notes out of everyday life, but you have to somehow transform them, and there has to be some kind of a twist that you start reading a poem and everything goes like in a quite normal, expected way, and then in a certain moment there is a twist, and the things turn out to be something else that you would expect, something like this.
I think you can see, the twist in all the poems, and I don't think the audience knows that you are an educated artist, a graphic artist, and you had a very thorough education at the Academy of Arts in Warsaw. And it's very obvious in your poems who are like images of words and sounds. But what made you choose writing before the arts? So.
Well, it wasn't really a choice. I used to write and paint from like early childhood, and it was like parallel things. But then I went to a high school with in a way humanistic profile, and it was quite terrible. So I thought, I don't want to study literature. I just want to study something else and to read and write by myself, like many writers do. And because I was always painting, I decided to study art, also to have some kind of to have different experience apart from literature. But then in a natural way, when I was, I don't know, about 19, 20, 21, writing became more important, and I felt that in visual art I'm not progressing really. I'm just, I can draw in a quite conventional way, and it can be even technically okay, but it's not something that I really can express myself through. And with writing, I felt that I am just moving forward. So after studies, I even had some commissions as an illustrator, but then I didn't care enough for it to continue. So yeah, it was also part of the problem was that the Warsaw Academy of Arts was really conservative, and I had enough. And probably if I would be really like a dedicated artist, I would still continue, but I just wanted to do something else.
So you have, but you continue to make the covers of your books. Those are photographs taken by Krystyna. And I was wondering, since you now no longer, you no longer draw or paint, but these photographs are quite lovely. And does photography, with its attention to detail, with its ability to capture detail, is this something that you see the same quality? I definitely think that several of your poems have this kind of photographic quality. Mm-hmm. Would you recognize that kind of characterization?
Well, I love to take photos, but I don't. I just do it for myself. I don't have any ambitions, to make an exhibition or anything. And I think this is the reason why I still do it, because with drawings, with paintings, I was too ambitious and nervous about it. And with photography, it's just a total freedom for me. And also when I travel, it's a kind of my notebook. I just take photographs, and I love to photograph people in the streets, and just, in a way, it's a kind of a visual diary. And I would not necessarily maybe compare poems to photographs, because in poems I like movement, and like the details in photographs are something still. So maybe I would not compare it, but for sure I just think with images, and also what you said, that photography has this skill to capture details, and also what is important, to capture a certain moment. Just sometimes you take a photo and it's just the one moment. For example, a person with an expression that next second it disappears, and you cannot even say what was it really. And in poems, I really love this quality. When, for example, as a reader, when a poem captures something, some kind of a moment which is very transient, very elusive. You cannot even say what it is exactly. So yes, so there is some kind of affinity, and and also what I said before, that I like specific experience, specific images. you know, I like poems that are about something, and they really create some images in the in imagination of readers. So, yeah.
I agree about the images, but I have to add that there is kind of a constant movement in your poems also. And I remember that you said that the motion is necessary in your creative process. To your kind of peripatetic fan.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I have to walk to write, and sometimes it's like there are two wonderful people that I met in Visby, Lena and Maria, and there is a wonderful writer's residency there, where I always wrote quite a lot, because this is a place when you can walk a lot and also swim. And for me, it's like really, I was joking then when I swim, I work, but there is something true in this, because when I move, I stop to think in a predicted, logic, reasonable way. I just stop think about thinking, and my thoughts go take ways that they just want to take. Yeah. And I just become much more free, and I think also in my poems there are many images, like a plane or a train or going somewhere, or a lot of images connected to the movement.
This is interesting. Excuse me, Irena, for butting in, but this fascinates me. Do you write while you are walking? Obviously not while you're swimming, but do you write while you are walking, while you're taking a walk, or afterwards when you returned?
Sometimes I always have a little notebook like this, and sometimes I write something, but usually I just do it in my head. I combine words in my head. Sometimes something that I have written before, I repeat it in my head, and then I can see that it is too long, for example, or it has not the right rhythm. Sometimes I walk to check if it's rhythmically okay. Usually I don't need to write while walking, because I just remember. Then I come back and write it down. But it's really, I am peripatetic, and I walk every day and just need it for life.
Well, it's a very trendy discussion subject. I think it's during the pandemic, everybody said how important it is to exercise to keep your brain.
I will just add one thing. I will just add one thing that I had to have quarantine, like many people, for 2 weeks. I couldn't go out even to, I don't know, throw the garbage, and I really felt like something wrong is going with my head, that I cannot really think well. So I started to dance in the evening. So I think it must have, it looked like as if I were mad, because I was just dancing in my little flat just to have this movement. But it was not the same, because walking is completely different. And this was the important experience for me when I was healthy. I was not sick. Everything was okay, but I just couldn't go out. I could really feel what it means to be in prison.
Let's turn to from the trendy subjects to eternal subjects. I noticed that you mentioned that the Art Academy of Warsaw, that you left it partly because it was quite conservative. What about the poetry that you then wrote? Was it also in a kind of reaction? Would you consider your poetry to break with then current trends or traditions in Polish poetry?
It was when I was maybe 18 and 19 years old. I fell in love with Paul Celan's poetry, like I think many people do. So I, of course, started to imitate him, and it was terrible. And but it was a bit in the spirit of what was then done in Polish poetry, because this linguistic poetry and hermetic poetry was very much in fashion. But then I got into like a really, you know, I couldn't really write anymore because it was totally not my language, not my experience, and the poems were really bad. And then after a while I thought I really hate Celan, I have to just stop reading him. And for a year or 2 years I stopped writing at all. I just thought I cannot write anything. And afterwards I just started to write a diary, and I started to write just notes from life, and they were quite prosaic, but it was, I think, a point of departure for the poems that I felt that are written with my own voice. They were much simpler, of course, than Celan's poetry, but they were mine. I mean, I could feel that I'm not imitating anyone, and I tried to avoid all the big metaphors, and just, it was even a big radical. Whenever I felt that I am like imitating someone or falling into some kind of cliche, I would just, you know, erase everything. And then I think, like, what my poetry right now is a bit like outsider. It's not really what is very trendy in Poland. So, because still this hermetic poetry, so-called, is most fashionable, and also poetry that is very much socially engaged, on the other hand. Yeah.
Polish, 20th century Polish poetry has been fairly well translated, or fairly richly translated into Swedish. We know of Czesław Miłosz, we know of Zbigniew Herbert, we know of Adam Zagajewski, etc., etc. Irena has done an important work with an anthology of Polish women poets. Irena, would you consider Polish female poetry to be different from this grand tradition that we know?
I don't think it's different. I think that women poets write about the same serious and profound, no, not profound, deep subject as their male colleagues, but there was some certain female poets that were either put aside or forgotten, like Anna Świerszczyńska, very good poet, who was almost totally forgotten until Czesław Miłosz started to translate her into English, and she became first famous in America, and then after that she became famous in Poland. But I don't think it differs from the male poetry. And I think that this situation has changed now in Poland. I have this feeling because almost all of the leading poets now are women, and nobody talks about them being women or writing women poetry. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I think the situation changed, and before, of course, it was important to talk about women's poetry to make it visible, but it's difficult to talk about certain characteristics, because, for example, I think there is much more in common, I don't know, between, for example, Szymborska and Herbert than, I don't know, Szymborska and Julia Hartwig. So, and today, that's true that there are many Polish women poets that are very good and with very distinct styles, and it's really difficult to find one, I don't know, to different, like to find a characteristic that is different from male poets. So I would not talk about specific tradition of women's writing. Maybe the important thing is to say that we had this tradition of great poets like Szymborska and Herbert and Miłosz, a kind of like, to say it in a very short way, philosophical writing, ironic, but also clear in like accessible. I mean, very profound and not easy, but accessible to the reader. And later, many poets thought, you know, it's important to experiment more in language and just to, in reactions to this great classical poets, they started to write in a more personal way and maybe more hermetic way and not so accessible, something like this.
Will you allow me an all too obvious question? Since you were the recipient of the Wisława Szymborska Prize in 2012, and Szymborska, like no one else, nobody of those we have already mentioned, has been read and appreciated and became very popular in Sweden. So what is your relation to her poetry?
I love her poetry, and she is one of my favorite poets. But I never ever tried to follow her. I'm saying this because, of course, because of this prize. People would say, okay, you are writing like Szymborska, but it's the case with other female poets writing in Poland who are abroad. They are usually compared to Szymborska because only Szymborska is known, and they are all very different. So I don't feel connection like in style or anything like this, but I think she's a great poet and one of my favorite, and I think it's really impossible to follow her style because she was so unique that you can only, if you write in a similar way, you can be only like a just lesser poet, you know.